All right, we are going to get started. We have a good group here with us. Thank you all for joining and who are on live with us now. We're really excited to get started on today's webinar. This webinar is titled Decoding the Energy Storage Market in the Northeast. And throughout the next hour, we're going to pretty much be doing exactly that. As the energy storage market in the Northeast continues to grow, policies and programs that enable you developers to deploy and monetize your behind-the-meter storage projects, they continue to change constantly. As we talk with more developers in the area, we've learned that there's a lot of confusion about those programs, what they mean for projects, their limitations, and how they're being utilized in the market today. And our goal on today's webinar is to hopefully demystify some of the misconceptions that developers that you guys are seeing and answer any questions about those programs and what the market really is going to look like in the future. We're going to cover a variety of regions within the Northeast, but really focusing today on New York and Massachusetts. And they are the areas that really are the most active with project development and incentive reservations that we've seen. And our speakers that we have on today have done a lot of research into these markets, and they've got a lot of great insights into those policies and programs. So before we get started, I just want to mention a couple of things. We are going to be sending out the slide deck and the recording of this webinar shortly following the ending. We're going to be highlighting again a few different markets within the Northeast. So if you do have questions, please chat them into the chat box, and we're going to be answering them at the end of the webinar. We are going to do our best. We've got a lot to cover today, so hopefully we will be able to get those questions answered for you at the end. So we are joined by, like I said, an awesome group of speakers and experts in this area. First, we have Dave Gahl. We'd like to say thank you to Dave for being on with us. He is the Senior Director of State Affairs in the Northeast for the Solar Energy Industries Association, or SEIA. He's the go-to guy on Northeast policy for us and probably for you, and we are excited to bring his expertise into this webinar. We're also joined by two of our Energy Tool-based team members, Quinn Laudenslager. He is the Senior Manager of Technology and Product Operations and is kind of our Massachusetts market specialist, along with Kevin Mulvey. He is the Manager of Technology and Product Operations and is kind of our New York specialist. My name is Tracy. I'm our Marketing Manager with Energy Toolbase, and I'm going to be moderating for the next hour. So with all of that, I do want to pass things off to Kevin to get us started.
Thank you, Tracy. Excited to be here today to talk about New York and some of the policies driving energy storage and the market growth we've seen there. I sit on the technology and product operations team, as you had mentioned, and among many other things, we kind of take on advanced support for a lot of these customized projects and these different complicated markets that we've been seeing. So I wanted to jump in and talk first about just kind of a high-level view of the policies that has driven the market to where it is today. And what we're seeing on the screen here on the left side, this list of climate targets that were codified into law by the 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. We have a pretty aggressive list here in New York of climate targets, and what we're really focusing on today is this 3,000 megawatts of energy storage by 2030. There's an interim target of 1,500 megawatts by 2025. And so far, New York has really been doing a great job of rolling out different policies and initiatives to drive to these kind of goals and numbers. And none more impactful thus far than the bridge incentives that were rolled out in 2018 with the energy storage order. They were broken into a few buckets: retail storage for projects under 5 megawatts, bulk incentives, which are larger scale projects over 5 megawatts. And there's also a single family residential bucket that's currently in Long Island only. And as we've seen over the past couple of years, these incentives have really done a great job of kickstarting the industry in New York for deployment of storage. But what we've also seen in New York is the deployment of front of the meter projects, and this is mainly attributed to the VDER program that was created that really incentivized these community distributed generation projects, or CDG, and we've seen a lot of them go live over the past couple of years. So that program has really shown some great success in kind of driving that section. But we've also seen some non-wires alternative projects from the utilities go in kind of on the larger scale, solving some of the transmission and distribution deferral issues they were having. And then there's the large scale market that is kind of grown upstate, participating in the wholesale market opportunities. And we'll see a lot more of that to come as FERC 841 and 2222 are rolled out and implemented. And then when it comes to behind the meter storage, there are definitely some areas of opportunity within certain utilities that have time of use rates and demand charges that cater to energy storage and its potential, as well as utility demand response programs. And what we're going to talk about in a little more detail a little later is the net metering successor tariff that was rolled out in July to be implemented in January 2022. That's going to paint the picture of how behind the meter storage will look in the future. But first, I wanted to jump into a little deeper detail on the VDER tariff. And if you've been doing work in the New York area, you know about this, you've seen it, you've heard a ton about it. So today I wanted to dive a bit more into the aspects of the stack that are a bit more impactful to energy storage and the value that it can provide, and that being the LSRV, DRV, and ICAP aspects. So for the LSRV, I wanted to make sure to touch on this today because I've had a handful of conversations over the past few months with developers in the area, and it's been a common misconception I've heard that LSRV is not available anymore. And there is capacity remaining among majority of the utilities, with the exception of NYSEG, Lower Hudson, Con Ed Westchester, and Central Hudson. Each utility does have designated zones with available capacity. And that's important to note because when citing projects and looking in different communities for where these projects might work, if you can plant one in an LSRV zone with available capacity, it can greatly increase the revenues, especially if you're looking in that Con Ed New York City, where there are still a handful of zones left, and the value there is almost 3 times greater than the closest next value, which is actually PSEG Long Island. But again, in any of the utility zones, if you do have an opportunity to install a project within those LSRV zones, there's a lot of value to be seen, and we'll take a look at that a little later on when I show some examples. But as for DRV, I wanted to talk about this aspect of the value stack because it does make up for a good portion of, or it could potentially make up a good portion of the revenues seen in VDER. It's very similar to kind of a time of use program. It's available in the summertime in peak windows, that's 2 to 7 p.m. But there are some variables in the Con Ed territory, and this is where kind of energy storage starts to play a bigger role into how to monetize in those zones. Instead of a single window, there's 4 different potential windows you might land in depending on your zone, which can be in the middle of the day, in the afternoon, or later in the evening. And again, we'll take a look at how that impacts design and energy storage dispatch strategy, and what needs to kind of be thought about to ensure you're capitalizing on those values. But again, looking at where that value is, Con Ed territory, again, almost 3 times greater, and this value is locked in for 10 years. But PSEG Long Island also pretty lucrative, and there's a couple of utilities where this value can definitely make a large chunk of the revenues. Now with ICAP, I wanted to talk about this a little bit because it's arguably one of the more complicated aspects of the stack. And that's because there's 3 options that you can choose from within ICAP, alternatives 1, 2, and 3. For energy storage, though, you're limited to alternative 2 or 3. And if it's a standalone storage project, you have to choose alternative 3. And what these mean, if we take a look at alternative 2, the way that's valued you have a dollar per kilowatt year value for each kind of NISO zone in New York. And that for alternative 2, that value is taken and divided by 240 or 245 hours, depending on the year. And that value is then spread out across those hours into windows similar to what we see in DRV. That's about 2 to 7 in those summertime kind of peak months. And then any exports during those windows, gain that additional value. In contrast, Alt3, instead of dividing that value out, it's a single peak for the year. The dispatch during that single peak will be credited with that full dollar per kilowatt year value. And what this creates is a real opportunity to add value to a project by going after Alt3. Now, depending on the design of the system and the capacity and duration of the battery, but if you have a battery dispatch during a single hour, all that it can dump or send to the grid with any additional kilowatt hours coming from solar will then be valued at that higher target versus kind of needing a larger capacity and duration battery to really get the full value of ICAP. And we'll look at that again a little closer on the next slide. But one thing to note, with that additional value comes some additional risk because you do need to forecast that peak load. So there needs to be some intelligence with the energy management system, forecasting when that peak load is and dispatching the battery for when those peak hours are going to be. And there's going to be some also design criteria that you're going to want to make sure that your energy storage unit can handle to make sure it can hit, say, back-to-back forecasted hours or whatever it may be and not miss that value. So on the next slide here, I wanted to give a little bit more of a granular view of how some of these values stack up with one another and kind of where that value is. So when we're looking at the map, and it really comes as no surprise, the highest value zones currently in New York are going to be in that downstate region in the Con Ed territory around New York City, Long Island, some of those more congested areas. That's going to be your NISO zones G through K. It's going to have your higher ICAP values, your higher LBMP values, and as I had kind of mentioned, the DRV values in Con Ed and PSEG are pretty lucrative. And LSRV, while extremely lucrative in Con Ed, New York City, and PSEG, again, if you could find space anywhere in the state, you're going to be able to really add value. But looking at some of these examples on the right, these are different scenarios you might run into and will impact how you need to design and plan your energy storage system. So in that first example, we're looking at a Con Ed territory with a 4 to 8 p.m. window. So there's some overlap with the ICAP values. But in this example, we're looking at an LSRV opportunity. Now that kind of serves as a DR program where you're going to have to respond to 10 utility calls throughout the year that are going to be 1 to 4 hours. In this case, looking at a 2-hour call, you could see in New York, if it averaged 2-hour calls over 10, that's 20 hours. It's going to give you a value of $7 per kilowatt hour. So instead of dispatching during those first 2 hours, the energy storage unit is going to have to recognize that there's a call today, which is going to know about a day before. I'm going to reserve my capacity, and instead of dispatching in those 16 and 17 hours, dispatch in the later 18 and 19, even though I'm going to miss an hour of ICAP, that's where the real value is. In that second example, we're looking at a shifted DRV zone where the hours are actually in the evening time and don't overlap with ICAP at all. So in this scenario, there's multiple kind of things to think about. One, right off the bat, you can see the opportunity for energy storage to arbitrage that cheaper energy instead of dispatching it to the grid earlier in the day, save that for the afternoon or the evening, I should say, and capitalize on that DRV value. But there's also an opportunity here to look at Alt3, where instead of missing out on that ICAP value, you can actually look to chase that peak, make sure you have the right algorithms telling you when to dispatch, still capitalize on ICAP value, and then, of course, on the days where you don't need to export for a peak, you have battery capacity for the DRV windows later in the afternoon. And then in that last example, we're just looking at what's pretty standard across all the other utilities outside of Con Ed, but even in Con Ed, this 2 to 6 window that completely overlaps with the ICAP. Here, a 4-hour battery can be set to simple scheduled dispatch. It doesn't have to worry about LSRV in this case, and there's not really any other considerations. It's a simple dispatch, a simple design. So, these are 3 of many possibilities of what you'd find throughout kind of that New York area. So it's just a matter of really understanding where the values are, what they are, and what sort of capacity and duration my system is. But it's also important to note that these values are what they are today, especially when it comes to ICAP, that isn't a locked-in value. You have to make sure that you're also planning for flexibility in the future, where today I can go after these ICAP values, but in 5 years, if that value isn't the same and there's another opportunity, I want to make sure that I can adjust my dispatch strategy through my control system to potentially go after some new value stream that comes about. So lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we see on the customer-sided side and the behind-the-meter energy storage opportunities. And this is what we're seeing with this net metering successor tariff that came out in July. 2 real big takeaways there, and one being the CBC charge, or the customer benefit contribution charge, that they're going to roll out come 2022, which is equivalent to the non-bypassable charges that we're seeing in California or elsewhere. And it's essentially just going to kind of impact the payback of an investment to a net metered system. But there's still a lot that is yet to be defined with those values and with some of the potential discounts you can get by applying for net metering with a different technology or a different rate schedule. So more to be seen there. But another impact that we saw from this that's going to potentially give some energy storage opportunity is the change in time of use crediting. Historically in New York, we've seen what they call kind of laning, where your exports during a time of use window can only be applied to imports during that same time of use window. But with this monetary crediting change, exports in any time of use window can be applied to a bill as monetary credits for imports during kind of any window. And that will create an opportunity potentially for energy storage to kind of arbitrage. And again, similar to kind of what we've seen happen in California over the past few years. And the other note from discussions in the net metering successor tariff is surrounding advanced metering infrastructure, where there's more rate reform that was envisioned by REV that's needed, and that's the real goal for New York. But without the mass deployment of advanced meters throughout small commercial and residential, utilities don't have that granular data yet at a large scale to really improve the price signals and change the rates to kind of mimic, again, what we're seeing kind of on the West Coast, and provide opportunity for energy storage to really be of value for not only an asset owner, but for the grid, right? Because that's the end goal, is to make sure the grid is stable for its customers. So with that, I wanted to pass it off to Dave, our policy expert in the Northeast, to talk a little bit more on these policies and kind of what's to come, and dive a little bit deeper.
Great, thanks, Kevin. Appreciate that. And thanks again to Energy Toolbase for having me today. Real quickly, I just wanted to describe my role at the Solar Energy Industries Association. So I think most people know the association, but we are the National Association for the Solar Industry. We have a goal of getting 20% of our nation's electricity from solar by 2030. And we look at storage as being a market accelerator and a critical tool to help achieve that large national goal of having much more solar on the system. So it's one of the reasons that we've paid a fair amount of attention to storage issues as well as solar issues in the Northeast. I manage all of our regulatory work in the 3 key states, Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey, as well as our legislative work there too. And so this slide basically is titled Policy Questions for Solar and Storage in New York. It could also be titled, Policy Uncertainties, or areas where there will be additional policy decisions. And I've broken this into 3 major categories. So the first, and Kevin touched on some of these issues, the first is the incentive availability for storage. So the the amount of incentives that are available now across the state have dwindled pretty significantly. In the rest of state blocks, so that's pretty much everything, north of the New York City metro area, all of those incentives have been spent down. All 4 blocks are allocated. In New York City, there's only about $240,000 remaining in storage incentives, and there's more availability in Long Island and Westchester. But this presents a series of policy choices for regulators. How are they going to potentially reallocate some of these incentives? For instance, maybe some of that Westchester money could be allocated to New York City. Is there going to be another round of bridge incentive? I mean, is there more money on the table for helping to achieve the state's storage goals per the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act? And then another question is whether regulators are, thinking about reimagining the way they are providing incentives to storage. For instance, there's some talk in certain policy circles about, maybe New York should establish a clean peak standard similar to what Massachusetts has recently adopted. So there's a lot of questions on the table about how to redesign the incentive structure, and so a lot of these questions will be taken up over the next year or so. The next sort of area of uncertainty, or some of the policy decisions that people should be paying attention to, are what Kevin alluded to here, which was some of the rate design details, specifically around the successor tariff to net metering in New York, remain undefined. What's clear is that the residential customers, or residential systems serving mass market customers will be subject to this customer benefit charge. But there are a number of other options where the CBC applicability has not yet been established. So it's not clear whether the customer benefit charge applies to a customer on a time of use rate or an optional standby rate, or how it will affect commercial customers. Because remember, in New York, projects under 700, solar projects under 750 kilowatts in size are also eligible for net metering. So this is especially murky, and especially murky for non-solar technologies, and the Commission will continue to make decisions and iterate on some of these questions over the next year or so, and SEIA will be heavily engaged. We were the lead intervener and have organized a coalition of groups on the successor, around the successor order, and we're going to continue to do so in 2021. The last area I wanted just to touch on quickly, it goes back to the value stack, which Kevin did a really nice job of explaining some of the functionality of the different components of the stack. But there are a lot of questions about the stack's economic viability for solar and storage projects at this point. We've seen low LBMP prices. And partly this is based on the COVID virus, but we've seen year-over-year declines in LBMPs, roughly on the order of 30 to 40% from 2019 to 2020. So those are near historic lows. Capacity pricing isn't likely going to increase dramatically because there's a lot more capacity coming onto the system from all the policy requirements and a lot of clean energy projects, which are important and essential, but that's going to keep capacity pricing relatively stable. And so regulators are beginning to ask questions about resetting the stack components. Are there ways to take another look at the way E-value is calculated? What about the DRV? Are there other components that should be included in the stack? And just SEIA has been paying close attention to this. We submitted a petition in 2018 and have been following up on this petition to recalculate environmental value to provide more value to customers. We're closely following the discussions around the updated DRV. So there's a lot more to come on value stack stabilization, and we're going to be hopefully getting some more compensation through the value stack for all kinds of different projects. So with that, I'm going to flip it over to Kevin, or not Kevin, excuse me, Quinn, to talk a little bit about the Massachusetts market.
Awesome. Well, great overview of New York. I hope I can do Massachusetts justice, just the same as you guys ran through. So the first thing we want to dive into is really very similar types of discussions about advanced metering infrastructure ultimately, and sort of what's going on with price signals and tariffs in Massachusetts. So we did a deep dive across the state and looked at about 82 different commercial rates to see what's really going on out there. So to put things into perspective, in the state, there's 4 electric distribution companies, there's 50 municipal lighting plants who aren't necessarily subject to the same rules and regulations as those 4, along with a multitude of retail energy providers. And what we see first and foremost when people are coming in and asking for what are the rates, or asking our rates team, hey, can you please model this particular customer savings? The big thing there is there's a lot of different variations. The second aspect to that is what we found in this deep dive, and really what we've all kind of seen, is that out of those 82 rates that we looked at, only 18 of them had some form of demand charge or time of use arbitrage differential that would allow for some type of monetization via behind the meter bill optimization. And when we look at the map here, we see these little sort of pins and some numbers and colors. And I want to decode that a little bit of just saying, hey, the number is representative of the number of rates in that region that had demand charges that met that criteria. And the color is essentially broken out into if it's less than $15 per kW. And also, first and foremost, most of those rates were really based on demand charges. We saw very few with time of use arbitrage. So to say they had demand charges that were less than $15 would be the blue pins. The yellow pins were between $15 and $20 a kilowatt month. And then the red pins we were seeing above $20 a kilowatt month. And in some extreme instances, particularly the B2 rate in the Boston territory on the eastern side, we were seeing rates in the summertime up to $42 for demand charges per kilowatt month. So really, when we're looking at that, those sound like those are great numbers, but when you take that and you look at how many rates exist, and you look at the different ways to monetize it, that's a lot of concentration for those demand charges or those opportunities to optimize behind the meter storage in Massachusetts. With that said, looking in the rest of the state, the vast majority of it, very few demand charges exist, except for maybe potentially on the western side, where we have one municipal lighting plant along with Eversource West that really do have some demand charges that get close. However, of course, infrastructure-wise and building opportunities or just projects that could be done behind the meter, most of them really exist on the eastern side of the state anyways. So with this dynamic, what we've really seen in the state is that the higher than average energy charges, which most of them are just flat kilowatt hour charges, really have helped spur along widespread solar adoption. But the reality that we've seen on the C&I space for solar and storage both actually is a lot of the net metering changes and really the SMART program rollouts that have ultimately, in some regard, hindered those installations. Maybe they have no export requirement, or potentially, they're getting market credits for net metering of only 60% of the kilowatt hour going to the grid. These changes to those two major incentives, or at least that methodology, have really kind of paused some of that behind the meter or customer sided storage. So what we want to do is go to the next slide here and really look at what incentives are out there in the state, what was the purpose, and kind of get a bigger picture of what's going on in Massachusetts. So we start going back and we're looking at SREC 1, SREC 2, which are the original two sort of incentives to incentivize solar. And really what we have right now is also smart and net metering. Now, all of those, their whole goal was really to boost renewables and fuel diversity. Increasing fuel diversity, increasing, those resources on the grid, ultimately, is going to be one aspect to this formula that we see up here. Currently, right now, that fuel mixture on the bottom there is essentially what the state sits at currently. The goal is to increase the renewables, much like we see in New York and a lot of other, states that have renewable mandates. But that aspect of boosting renewables, largely solar and some wind in there, they're one aspect to it, increase the fuel diversity. The next piece, which we've seen roll out, and Dave alluded to, the Clean Peak standard that was recently adopted, along with Connected Solutions, which is the predominant demand response program in the major EDC's territory. Both of these programs very specifically are looking at targeting the top hours. So while solar helps increase field diversity, it doesn't necessarily help with the overall grid peak. And we've seen this term, we hear it a lot in the solar world of the duck curve that's occurring. But ultimately, that is the graph for the New England ISO, where they're looking at 3,000 megawatts of solar ultimately only reduced the peak by about 384 megawatts. So when you have programs like Clean Peak Standard, which are encouraging you to shift your energy to the later hours, 3 to 8 or whatever the window is for that season, and Connected Solutions saying, hey, behind the meter assets, reduce your load between 2 and 7. These two programs, ultimately their goal is to reduce that peak even further. Now, all of this, both of these aspects, really the goal is price stability, much like what Kevin said. It's grid stability, price stability. And when you have too much penetration of distributed energy resources in a particular area, it can actually be a negative consequence to not only grid stability, but price stability. So moving on to the next slide, we want to talk a little bit about what are the basics for behind the meter? What should we be considering? And the first one I want to highlight here is really that top box. When you're looking at behind the meter, we hear a lot, hey, let's stack every possible incentive we can on there. I know that there's a demand response program. I've heard about Clean Peak Standard. And really what you have to focus on there is you don't get both in behind the meter. You can pick one or the other. And so the next aspect of looking at what are the other opportunities, okay, we've got bill optimization, we've got SMART as another incentive, we've got the investment tax credit and potentially bonus depreciation on top of all of those pieces that can filter into essentially increasing or providing the best value for that asset. Now, the one thing that we want to make sure is clear, and this is something I see quite a bit, particularly in the state, is really these few things here. Know the rates. Are they bundled? Are they unbundled? If they're unbundled and they have a retail energy provider, what are they buying their energy at? Those aspects are key to evaluating what is the value of solar and storage to the client. The next part, which we've seen go all over the place, is know the load. There's a lot of situations where interval data may not be available, and that is a huge key aspect when you're trying to evaluate bill optimization, largely revolving around demand charge management. If you don't have interval data, yes, we can model, and yes, many people can model the actual expected load, but that does not indicate what the actual peak load would be. The next part there, of course, is just simply the customer. Are they going to be adding or reducing load? And really, how is that going to affect the economics? This third bullet point here is huge. And really, it's evaluating stacked and competing strategies. Can they even stack, as we saw with Connected Solutions and Clean Peak Standard? The answer would be no. In that case, which one is worth more? And the last one, which we're going to get a little bit more into later on, is just how do they interact? So we'll dive into that detail here in a moment. The next piece is really just understanding the site limitations. Net metering, do they have it? Is it option? What are they going to be under? Are they going to be under market credits, or are they small residential, small commercial, and they're going to get 100% value minus the actual charges that they don't get credit for? Beyond that, there may be some limitations of just non-export, or maybe non-export during some hours. We've seen all kinds of different situations, and Dave's going to talk a little bit more about sort of what those limitations or interconnect problems in general in a moment. And then the last piece, of course, for storage in Massachusetts is really just tied to solar generation. Not only is it tied to can the solar system charge my battery to participate in some of these programs, but also 100% of your SMART incentive based on your solar generation. So with all that said, we really are saying in this piece, after you've done all those, is set reasonable assumptions. You can't always stack every incentive, even if you wanted to, even if you could. It might not even make sense. understanding the export limitations and probably setting a little bit of conservative approach on what those are worth are really important. So moving on to the next piece, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into these incentives and really understanding, these risks. And these sort of three big questions on the right, we've talked a little bit about that, but can solar charge my battery? Can I even get the full value of that in that situation? Is there enough solar energy in this particular region to do that? Do the incentives stack? And can I export, right? So when we look at each one of these incentives with SMART, well, starting out with SMART here on the left, we have declining blocks. So over time, that the monies will be worth less and ultimately eventually going away. I'm going to let Dave talk more about, sort of what the current status of SMART rollout. They have the other 1.6 gigawatt that's available. And then out of all that, we also want to make sure we're really highlighting and driving home, yes, there is a solar or a storage adder, but 100% of the incentive is based on what the solar system is actually generating. So when you're evaluating, the storage incentives, factoring those things are critical. Moving down to Clean Peak Standard, which is something that probably I get asked about the most, is let's look at it for a lot of these systems. And I'm going to say for the typical behind the meter project, you're better off with connected solutions. However, just understanding some of the risks or values to it are important, because obviously you don't want to just disregard it and say it's never going to work, or the economics behind it are better than what I have from these other strategies. But the things we want to highlight there is it can't stack with connected solutions, you can't pick both. It may interfere with your bill optimization strategies. So when we look at demand charge management, this is an example of a customer's actual load profile here on the right-hand side on the bottom, where their demand charges were really kind of focused on early morning. In that situation, discharging in the late afternoon, you wouldn't have 100% of your battery available in most cases. And who knows, if you discharged your battery 100%, you may miss the next morning's peak. So understanding those risks of how they interfere are key aspects to every analysis that goes through for a project, or should. The final point here is that the certificate value, the CPEC value, is variable, and there is no floor, which will 100% depend on the market conditions. So just like other REC programs that have been out there, these are traded and bought and sold based on availability and who's sort of posting them on the market. Now there is a maximum cap of $45 per certificate. And then of course you have all the multipliers that we could have probably an entire webinar alone on Clean Peak Standard. But just understanding that one risk, that those market variable dependent on how much those CPECs will truly be worth. Moving into connected solutions, this one again really can interfere with bill optimization strategies. The big one there is that the validation of performance. So is it in Eversource East and they can have a meter that validates it, or is it in National Grid and Unitil, where they're really sort of taking a customer baseload and figuring out what you did during that event. So really understanding, and this is every demand response program out there, ultimately is, how does the validation work and how do I analyze that for my customer? The final part there is there's really no defined successor, right? You have a 5-year look ahead at best, and then beyond that, what are you replacing that revenue stream with? Most likely maybe another demand response program, or maybe potentially Clean Peak Standard is where it could potentially fit in. Finally, the non-bypassable charges on NEM and understanding kind of what those look like, of just saying, hey, market credits, you're only getting 60%. There is a few things that we would consider non-bypassable charges. Really anything outside of transmission, distribution, and energy fit into that bucket. And then the other piece is just, we hear this a lot, lack of visibility on NEM credits. People that the developers out there, they're selling systems into the market. When you actually look at what the customer is getting on their energy value, which is local hub zone pricing and the transmission and distribution and all those other credits, ultimately on the customer's bill, all they see is a one lump sum value. So just understanding kind of what would be expected on the tail end of it after you install a solar and storage system for somebody, what the customer is going to see are key aspects to the risk, because customer mitigation or risk management on that side are key aspects to getting new customers. Nobody wants anybody that's upset with the results. And then the last part there is just declining availability. We see over time that there'll be less availability of NEM, and eventually, there'll have to be some other stuff, which is a good point for me to leave off and hand it back to Dave to talk about sort of what's coming up in Massachusetts.
Great, thanks, Quinn. That was terrific. Yeah, so here's again some policy questions, areas of uncertainty, areas where we're intending to spend some time in the next couple of years. Quinn alluded to this in his presentation. The first, major area of uncertainty and one of the challenges that we've faced in Massachusetts on both the solar and the storage side is really just hangups related to interconnection. I would highly recommend, if you don't already look at these reports, the U.S. Solar Market Insight report that's put out by Wood Mackenzie and SEIA has excellent commentary on describing sort of the situation on the ground with interconnection in Massachusetts. And there is commentary on markets across the country too, but these write-ups have been very, very well done. And the short story here is that the utilities and to some extent ISO New England, based on the sheer amount of solar and storage projects that were moving through the queues to be connected, they launched a series of study processes to understand what the impact on the grid was going to be by all this solar and storage. And as a result, they delayed hundreds of megawatts worth of projects as they conducted these studies just to understand what the impacts were. Some of the projects even had existing interconnection service agreements, and they were still held up. We've largely worked through those issues already, but the study process is still underway with for a number of megawatts worth of projects in the Commonwealth. In addition to the study processes, related to the study processes, the timelines for bringing solar and storage systems onto the system has been very slow and continues to sort of drag on. And the costs that the utilities are passing through to developers and to firms that are building these projects continue to increase. It's interesting because on the one hand, we've seen solar component prices, panel prices, technology prices go down. On the other hand, we've seen interconnection prices go way up. And so the developers are on the hook for those interconnection costs on both the solar and storage side. So it's becoming an increasing problem, and it's making some projects uneconomic, and has resulted in the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities not only launching an investigation, at least into some national grids practices about interconnecting projects, but also just a larger policy docket about how do we streamline the process for bringing new resources onto the system? How can we prevent some of these projects from problems from happening in the future? And then even taking another look at cost allocation. Does it make sense for the project developers to be completely on the hook for all the costs, or can there be some sort of cost sharing between the utilities, ratepayers, and the developers? So lots of questions around interconnection. SEIA has been working closely with our partner, the Northeast Clean Energy Council, in this docket in the Commonwealth, and there's more to come on this one over the next year or so. The second area of uncertainty, and I think I field this question a lot from my members, involves the update to the SMART program and the expansion of the SMART program. So just as context, I think everybody knows this, but the SMART program is a program to incentivize solar. The first amount of capacity that was made available was 1,600 megawatts. And over the course of the last year, the Department of Energy Resources has finalized an expansion of the SMART program, which includes an adder for storage. So if you're pairing your solar system with storage, then there's some additional resources on the table for you, as well as a new requirement that all large projects, anything over 500 kilowatts in size, needs to be paired with storage. So that's another feature. DOER finalized emergency regulations codifying the expansion and many of these program reforms in April. And then in the formal process went through and made some minor adjustments and finalized a complete set of regulations in July of this year. However, because the incentive is driven through a utility tariff and it's paid through a utility tariff, the utilities have to file updated tariffs with the Department of Public Utilities for approval. And so the utilities have not done that yet. The department has not ruled on anything yet. And as a result, the SMART program is essentially, the expanded SMART program, I should say, is essentially on hold until the DPU rules on some of these major issues. Remember, jurisdictionally, the DPU has the responsibility of making sure that rates and incentive program costs are just and reasonable, and therefore they have to go through a series of questions and make a ruling and determination authorizing the program to move forward. So I get this question a lot. The expansion, you can apply for an expansion, or you can apply for an allocation, statement of qualification through the SMART program right now, but they're not going to, DOER is not going to issue anything until the DPU rules on the broader program. So that's coming up. The last point I just wanted to make, and this is kind of ties back to interconnection, but the Massachusetts just generally has an aging grid, and unlike some other states, Massachusetts hasn't modernized as quickly as other jurisdictions. There have been a number of rounds of talks about grid modernization in Massachusetts, but some of those planned investments were either shelved or they've been stalled for one reason or another. Advanced metering infrastructure is still years away from being rolled out in Massachusetts. So, I think there's a lot of work that the state can do to improve the grid, to make more opportunity for developers. And so they started a new grid mod docket recently that will hopefully result in some of these improvements. But Massachusetts has a ways to go there, and that's another area where SEIA will be engaged. And I was even a co-author on a couple of papers about grid modernization and what some of these improvements could mean for developers. So looking forward to getting more involved in that. And that wraps up those policy questions for Massachusetts. I think I'm going to flip it back to Tracy now, and she can moderate some questions that we may be receiving.
Yes, that sounds good. Thank you, Dave, Quinn, and Kevin. We're getting to the top of the hour, so we do want to kind of answer some of these questions. Dave, one did come in for you when we were talking about the New York market. So it said, when you say capacity prices will decrease, are you referring to statewide or in a particular zone? Some market sources indicate higher capacity price in the downstate zones over the next few years.
Yeah, that's a good clarification. I mean, I think there's going to be a fair amount of capacity that's added to the system upstate. There's always some constraints downstate just based on lack of available space and market concentration and whatnot. So I think probably the capacity prices in the upstate zones are likely to be stable to declining.
And then, and then to follow up on that, also asked, does SEIA publicize any of their viewpoints on future capacity prices?
We tend to stay out. Well, the Solar Market Insight Report provides some big picture forecasts of what we think the solar market would do, and there's a fair amount of modeling that goes into coming up with those forecasts. I don't believe the reports that I've looked at, go into great detail on, the underlying assumptions there. But there are plenty of other firms that do provide those kinds of price forecasts, and that's all available for speak for service kind of stuff. So it's out there, but that's not something that we've generally made available.
Okay, yeah, and following up on that, for the person that asked that, everything those resources Dave is talking about, we are going to have in the slide deck when we send out to you guys. I kind of want to talk about this a little bit. We've touched on New York and Massachusetts specifically, but what do you think, what's causing New York and Massachusetts specifically to have such substantial activity for solar and storage projects compared to other markets? And maybe I'll give that to Quinn or Kevin.
Sure, I'll jump in on that, and then I think we can kind of tag team if there's anything I missed there. The big one is ultimately going to be, mature market with ways to incentivize solar and storage together, as well as just sort of on the cutting edge of some of those market trends. So what we've seen in VDER with the value stack and what they're doing in that market, plus just what we're seeing with Clean Peak Standard in Massachusetts. These are going to be things that we expect to kind of roll out. But really the big two is ultimately just you can monetize it, and there's incentives to push it that are back, so it makes it easier to finance. Dave, Kevin, do you guys have anything to add to that?
This is Dave. The one thing I'll say is that, I think one market to keep an eye on is New Jersey. Policymakers in New Jersey are looking at many of the same kinds of policy tools that New York and Massachusetts have used. They're talking about an incentive program there for storage. They're talking about, pairing storage and solar, talking about grid modernization. So, I think increasingly we're going to talk about those three states as being, kind of an anchor states for the region on both fronts.
Thank you both. And we've had a couple questions about SMART and the deadlines on that stuff. So I do just want to ask, somebody did ask, is there a deadline for Massachusetts utilities to file the updated SMART tariffs? And once they file, how long is it going to take for them to approve them? We did have a couple questions on that.
Yeah, I can take that one. So there is no deadline for filing for the utilities. There's some talk, within the policy community about whether the tariff revisions that they file could be divided up into different tracks. Like, for instance, sort of a fast track on non-controversial issues like setting the blocks rate and the incentive rates, and then potentially on some of the more controversial issues that could come up in the docket. But we're still waiting for them to file. And then after they do file something, it could take a while. Hopefully, maybe this two-track approach will get the program moving more quickly, especially as we're dealing with an economic recession. And then we can take up the more controversial items on a longer term. The last time when the SMART program was first authorized, it was nearly a year between when the regulations were filed, or right around a year between when the regulations were filed and when the program was authorized to begin. We're hoping it doesn't take nearly that long this time. So that's a key area that I'm going to be focusing on.
All right, a couple more. Hopefully we can get these last ones in. Talk a little bit, someone asked, Quinn and Kevin more so, what is your experience working with developers in the Northeast as it pertains to Energy Toolbase, like our products being available to those developers?
So I'm going to talk a little bit about Massachusetts, and I'll let Kevin kind of chime in there. But I think it's kind of a three-prong piece. So obviously, we're probably most well known for our platform, so modeling both solar and storage. The challenge there has been some of those programs are new or unique, so being able to support those is actually where Kevin and I spend most of our time. So technology and product operations is really there to support understanding and coaching developers and anybody interested in how to best monetize those projects. We both come from a construction background, so also if there's issues with understanding good design and what are the best practices, we always do our best to give good advice. we track policy, we bring in experts and education as we're doing today. And then finally, we actually have now a controls product as we merged with Payson Power September of last year. So really providing and our goal, if we were to put it easily, would probably be to be breaking down the barriers to participating in accelerating storage deployment in every region that we support, which right now we were just focusing on the Northeast for this webinar, but goes beyond just that. Kevin, you want to talk a little bit about New York or anything along those lines?
Yeah, for sure. And just to kind of echo what you said, it's been a kind of a tier 2 level of support, as our modeling platform, very well known in the industry. But when looking at the New York market specifically, being able to model these VDER values, especially for kind of a front of the meter project, hasn't historically been a product feature of ETB, but that has been in development. And as it stands today, we have kind of tools behind the scenes where Quinn and I have been kind of working to help developers specifically model these kind of customized programs as we're working to launch these features into the platform. And looking at some of the demand response programs and how those can kind of play into values, if it's worth it or not, has just taken a little bit of extra support that we provide to developers. And then, yeah, with the controls, specifically kind of back to VDER, looking at all three and how we can make sure that a developer will be comfortable and confident to go after those kind of values and be able to provide the controls that can do that is what we've been focusing on getting our product to do.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. I do want to, one more question. There are a lot of questions regarding specific projects, different municipalities. So I do kind of want to overlook those, and then we will get to those. We are going to outreach to you guys personally after the webinar to get those answered. But a little bit quickly, Dave, talking about net metering and the confusion developers are facing. Some types of projects, solar projects, are capped, some aren't, and some utilities caps have been hit and some hasn't. And can you kind of walk through this whole scenario and kind of why it stands that way?
Yeah, it's complicated, and it does help to have experts like Quinn and Kevin, to walk you through some of the details here. But generally speaking, there are different caps set for different types of projects in the Commonwealth. Residential solar projects are uncapped, but then larger projects are capped, and larger private projects have a caps per utility territories, and then there are larger public projects as well that are also have net metering caps. And as Quinn alluded to earlier in the presentation, all the projects that are subject to these net metering caps, you only get 60% of the full retail value of the export credit. So there's a lot of complexity here. I don't think we have time to go into all the details today, but I think firms can help understand some of the complexity here and sort out the confusion around net metering.
Thank you. We are at the hour, so I kind of want to end there in case anybody else has, we don't want to go too much over. Thank you again to our speakers, Dave, Quinn, Kevin. You guys provided some great insight. Please be patient with us. We're going to try to respond to these questions after the webinar, either today, tomorrow, hopefully no later than Monday. And I know, like I said, we covered a lot throughout today's webinar. A lot of great resources. We are going to be sending out this whole slide deck, the recording, and in that slide deck, we're going to have a lot of links to the stuff we talked about today. And like we said, Energy Toolbase, we also publish a lot of blogs and different kinds of content related to the Northeast. So please make sure to check that out. And if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to contact any of the speakers we just heard. We have some New York focused and Massachusetts focused account managers, Chris and Susan, if you'd like to reach out to them, schedule a meeting with them to talk a little bit more about your projects in the Northeast, designing them, installing them, deploying them. I've included their contact information here. Again, please be on the lookout for the follow-up email with all this great stuff in it. And we hope you enjoyed it. Thank you again to Dave and Quinn and Kevin.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.